investing in property makes sense. Investing in the right property takes knowledge. Welcome to the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. I'm Jarrod McCabe, Director of Wakeland Property Advisory. Join me for expert insights into the fundamentals, trends and opportunities to help you create long-term wealth through smart property decisions. Hi everyone and welcome to episode 59 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. So we're now moving into part 3 of our Reminiscing with Richard series. So again, joined by none other than Richard Wakeland. Welcome, Richard.
Thanks, Jarrod, very much. It's good to be back.
Yeah, it's great to have you again. So today we'll follow on from last time. We talked about the what, where, when, why around investment property and purchasing your first investment. And we led people to the understanding that today we'd be talking around timing with buying property and time in the market rather than trying to time the market. And obviously time just generally with life is a very important aspect. We've only got a certain amount of it. So how does that relate to investment property?
In the last podcast we did, Jarrod, we spoke about land as being one of the most important words in the world of property investment. But the other important word is time.
Yeah.
Yet again, another 4-letter word I might add. So understanding the importance and value of time. What we need to do is we need to learn to use it wisely. And I emphasise the point about starting early and not squandering time.
So you mentioned that last time to get in. I mean, obviously no one should be putting themselves under silly pressure or silly expectations, but the earlier you can get in, the more advantageous it'll be for you longer term.
Absolutely. And that's the important point about getting an early start. And as we said earlier, it's all about time in the market and not trying to involve yourself in timing the market. And the reason why I say don't involve yourself in trying to understand timing the market is because you never know when a market is peaked or troughed until after it's actually happened.
Yeah, so we can look back now and say that we think with the ups and downs of the pandemic property market that things probably peaked around October, November 2021, I think it was. Yep, 2021. Yeah. And then they started to slowly slide and they probably hit the bottom around the same time last year, October, November or December 2022, and have stabilised since. But again, as you said, we're making those calls 3 to 6 months after the event occurs.
Yeah, and so what can happen, and I've seen it so often over the years, is that, for example, a $700,000 property can quickly become a $770,000 property because when markets move again, they can move very quickly.
Overnight almost,
overnight in a suburban markets. So I repeat again, time is such a valuable and important resource, and remember at all times that it's irreplaceable. So using it wisely can have a profound impact on how you create financial independence, security for the future, so that you're not actually relying on the government pension or your own super.
Sure.
So the other thing to do is understanding time means being particularly patient. You really have to be patient, and passive property ownership is about the long-term journey. Property moves in cycles. It doesn't suddenly, keep repeating itself year after year, increased growth. It does take a breather from time to time, and we'll talk about why and how it takes a breather. But being patient will reward you, let's say, time and time again.
Great. Okay, no problems.
Economic and investment cycles, that's one that we can't get overly specific about, only for the reason that no two economic investment cycles are ever the same. But there are some common characteristics that come through every time, and one of the important ones is the subject of interest rates and the relationship to inflation. And certainly inflation and interest rates can have a big big influence on property markets.
Well, inflation's obviously a hot topic at the moment, but for a lot of people who might have only gotten into the property market in the past 5 to 7 or 8 years, inflation probably hasn't formed a big part of their property journey.
Yeah,
because it hasn't been overly strong for a period of time.
Absolutely, and that's why I want to try and spend a little bit of time going into the historical perspective and getting an understanding about the fact that property is a long-term journey. So what we're seeing at the moment, as we've seen over many, many years, is that the Reserve Bank increases rates, they decrease rates to curb inflationary pressures. And one really important point to remember is that top-performing investments are not reliant on inflation for capital growth. This is very simply the result of underlying demand that exceeds supply. So it's important to note that prices have risen when inflation was low.
Okay.
Also be aware that people can be confused about second-rate property increasing in value, but it's increasing in value only on the back of inflation. So it's all very well when we've got high inflation that second-rate property will show capital growth, but it quickly fades away when inflation is curbed.
So that's the all boats rise on a rising tide type scenario, and you need to be able to distinguish the difference.
Yeah. Over the years, I mean, if we keep talking about the historical perspective, over the years I've seen heaps and heaps of misinformation, fear through sensational headlines in newspapers and magazines, ignorance, external influences, and at the end of the day, what that does is it just spooks investors. So people who have never bought property when they should have done, or indeed people selling because they're fearful of the worst possible outcome, all of that tends to contribute to a lack of confidence in owning property. What I want to do is just look back in time and quickly move through the decades and talk about low inflation, high inflation, and then we can talk about the influences of government intervention. But if we go back, for example, to the 1960s, there was strong growth, but that was in a very low inflation environment. Then if we look at the 70s, in the 70s and the early 80s, we had high inflation. In the late 70s, borrowing rates rose from 8-9% to around 14%, and inflation was around 12%. Now, once again, this was a period of strong growth. Around 1990, rates rose to 17%, and that really, really sent shudders at the time through the property market.
The recession we had to have.
Absolutely. The early 2000s saw, rather similar to the circumstances we are living in at the moment, saw interest rates rise 10, 11, 12 times, and as I said, very similar to what we're going through at the moment. It's important to understand that interest rates are the main lever to bring inflation down. So what I guess I'm trying to say here is that the long-term journey it's all about thinking long-term and not short-term. And once again, understand the value of time and overcome any fear of debt. Now, we did speak in an earlier podcast about good debt, bad debt, or let's say productive debt, unproductive debt, and not putting yourself in a difficult position where you can't afford to fund the purchase of a particular property, and looking at the measures that you can put in place to ensure that you're not in a situation where you're forced to sell. And that's all part of the long-term journey. The other thing I wanted to cover here is the issue of government intervention. And government intervention can have a significant effect on property markets, but usually it's only a short-term significance. And people often overreact to new rules that may or may not come into place, or rules that are currently in place. And what happens is that investor confidence is lowered, and there is often a temptation to either do nothing or sell up. If we go back as an example, to get things into perspective on the subject of government intervention, if we go back, for example, to the 1980s, and I use the 1980s because there was a whole heap of government intervention which you would think would stop any further promising activity on the subject of property ownership. We had changes to the capital gains tax, we had changes to negative gearing, we had the residential tenancies legislation being tightened up, we had high interest rates in the 80s, particularly in the latter part. We then had first home buyer grants coming into play. In fact, in the very early 80s, they came in at that point in time where, as I remember it, in 81, 82, the markets were quite subdued and interest rates were high, and the government in the latter part of 82 brought in home buyer grants. Well, unfortunately, and I think we share the same view, Jarrod, that government grants tend to inflate property prices.
Yeah, they do. And we've seen it many, many times. And the grants come in all sorts of shapes and sizes and in different forms. But typically, we find that rather than creating extra affordability, extra equity, they just push prices further up, and people view them as free money and continue to borrow just as much, but just use that money to increase their capacity.
Yeah. So what I want to say is, and reiterate the point, is that good property always survives whatever government intervention.
Same thing happened again more so recently from my perspective with the GST. There was a lot of doom and gloom around the GST when that came into play and how that would impact on property as well. Didn't seem to have too much of an impact. The early 2000s, the market was pretty hot.
Yeah. So if a market is being held down, and the longer it's held down, the greater the next rise will take place.
Okay.
So once again, it's a case of patience and understanding that you sit tight, you don't get diverted, you get on that long road.
Yep.
You don't get distracted by fads and fashions, which might be taking side roads and then hitting a dead end only to turn back on the road that you should have stayed on.
In the first
instance. It's a very, very passive approach to long-term ownership. But you've got to get it right from day one, and you've got to put the different components and elements together in a very particular way.
Very good. Okay, so as Richard said, your timing is very important, but it's time in the market rather than timing the market. So when you should buy or when you should sell, you get in when you can afford to, and get in as early as you can, and then have the property start working for you so that you can take advantage of, hopefully, the equity that's built up over a long period of time for you.
Exactly.
Well, that's another great episode. Thanks again, Richard, for joining me. It's been very enlightening. Hopefully all the listeners have found that as well.
Thank you, Jarrod.
And hopefully we'll get you back again soon. But otherwise, thanks again for joining me for today's episode. It's episode 59 of the Rewarding Property Decisions podcast. If you could share the podcast far and wide, it'd be much appreciated. But if you would like further information, please visit our website, wakeland.com.au, and we wish you all the best with your property decisions.